By 1943, the skies over Europe had become one of the deadliest battlefields in human history. Every day, hundreds of Allied bombers crawled across enemy territory, slow, heavy, and painfully visible. To German fighter pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109, these bombers looked like helpless prey. The Luftwaffe had years of experience tearing apart unescorted aircraft, and confidence ran high. Bomber gunners were considered a nuisance, not a real threat. Inside the bombers, however, the reality was very different. A bomber gunner's job was one of the most terrifying roles of the war. Exposed in glass turrets or open waist positions, surrounded by freezing air at high altitude, they watched enemy fighters close in at terrifying speeds. They were trained to stay calm, fire short bursts, conserve ammunition, and above all, react only when the enemy committed to an attack. Doctrine ruled everything. Breaking it was dangerous. Ignoring it was considered suicide. On one particular mission, deep over occupied Europe, a formation of Allied bombers found itself under heavy attack. Dozens of Bf 109s climbed above the formation, then dove down in fast, disciplined runs. Tracers ripped through the sky. One bomber fell out of formation, burning. Another began to lag behind. The German pilots sensed weakness and pressed harder. Inside one bomber, a single gunner realized something chilling. If the attacks continued this way, his aircraft would not survive. The fighters were too fast, too precise, and too confident. Waiting for the perfect shot meant waiting to be killed. In those few seconds, the gunner made a decision that went against everything he had been taught. He stopped thinking defensively. Instead of reacting to the fighters, he began studying them, how they approached, how they broke away, and where they always seemed to escape. What he noticed was simple but deadly. The Bf 109 pilots were flying predictable paths. Every attack ended the same way, and that predictability opened the door to an idea so reckless, so dangerous, that even other gunners would later call it insane. In the next few minutes, the sky would explode into chaos, and the rules of air combat would never be the same again. To understand why the gunner's decision was considered suicidal, you must understand how bomber defense was supposed to work, and why it so often failed. Allied bomber crews were trained under a harsh reality. They were not expected to dominate the sky. Their job was survival, not victory. The bombers' guns were meant to scare attackers away, not destroy entire fighter formations. German pilots knew this. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was built for aggression. Fast, light, and deadly, it allowed pilots to choose when and how to attack. Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized surprise, short firing windows, and clean escapes. Fighters would dive through bomber formations, fire at close range, and then pull away before gunners could react properly. Most kills happened in seconds. Bomber gunners, by contrast, lived in a defensive nightmare. Their visibility was limited by metal frames and thick glass. Their guns froze, jammed, or overheated. Ammunition belts were finite, and resupply was impossible once airborne. Firing wildly was not bravery, it was a fast way to become helpless later in the mission. That is why gunners were drilled to fire only when absolutely certain. Short bursts, controlled tracking, no panic. But this doctrine had a hidden flaw. It assumed the fighter pilot always controlled the fight. On this mission, as Bf 109s attacked again and again, the gunner saw the pattern forming clearly. The fighters came in from similar angles, using the same escape routes every time. Their confidence had turned into habit. They believed the bombers would always respond the same way, late, cautious, predictable. The gunner understood the risk immediately. If he broke doctrine and fired continuously, he could drain his ammunition in minutes. His guns could overheat, and worst of all, he would reveal his firing position, making himself a priority target. If the tactic failed, he would be dead within seconds. But if he did nothing, death was guaranteed anyway. So he chose the only remaining option: change the fight itself. Instead of aiming at individual aircraft, he imagined the sky as a map. Instead of targets, he focused on space, where fighters passed, where they escaped, where they believed they were safe. What he prepared next was not marksmanship, it was a trap. And once the first Bf-109 flew into it, there would be no time for the others to escape.
The first fighter came in exactly as the others had. A steep dive, guns flashing for a brief moment, then a hard pull upward to escape the bomber's defensive fire. From the German pilot's perspective, it was a routine attack. Dangerous, yes, but familiar. What he did not know was that the gunner was no longer reacting to him. He was waiting for him. The moment the Bf-109 reached its escape angle, the gunner squeezed the triggers and did not let go. Instead of a short burst aimed at a single aircraft, a solid stream of tracer fire carved through the sky. It was not precise in the traditional sense. It was wide, continuous, and placed exactly where the fighter had to fly. The German pilot flew straight into it. Witnesses later described the fighter shuddering violently before rolling onto its side, smoke pouring from the engine. It fell away from the formation, disappearing below the clouds. Almost immediately, another Bf-109 followed the same path and met the same wall of fire. Within seconds, confusion spread through the attacking fighters. Pilots pulled harder than planned, broke formation early, or hesitated at the last moment. That hesitation was deadly. One fighter clipped another while attempting to evade. A third stalled after pulling up too sharply and dropped nose first into a spin. Inside the bomber, the intercom erupted with shouting. Gunners called out targets. The pilot struggled to keep the aircraft steady as tracers passed dangerously close to the wings. The air smelled of cordite and burning oil. The gunner's barrels glowed hot, but he refused to stop. The Luftwaffe pilots tried to adapt, but momentum worked against them. High-speed attack runs left no room for improvisation. The escape corridor, once their safest path, had become a killing zone. Radio messages captured later spoke of panic and disbelief. Pilots warned each other that bomber fire was too heavy and placed ahead of us. Some broke off the attack entirely. Others never had the chance. In roughly 4 minutes, the assault collapsed. Several Bf-109s were destroyed outright. Others were damaged badly enough that they never returned to base. The remaining fighters disengaged, leaving the bombers stunned but alive. The sky fell silent. And in that silence, a terrifying realization spread through both sides of the battle. The bombers had learned how to fight back.
For years, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had dominated the skies through discipline and predictability. That predictability, however, was based on assumptions, and those assumptions were now dangerously wrong. German pilots believed bomber gunners were reactive, cautious, and limited by fear. This belief was reinforced by hundreds of successful interceptions early in the war. When something works repeatedly, it becomes doctrine. When doctrine hardens, it blinds. The Bf-109 was designed for fast, aggressive attacks. Its pilots trained to dive, fire briefly, and escape before gunners could track them properly. The escape phase of the attack was considered the safest moment. Once the fighter pulled away, it was assumed the gunner would lose sight, hesitate, or conserve ammunition. That assumption shaped every attack run. What the gunner did shattered that mental model. German pilots were not prepared for a bomber gunner who treated the sky itself as a target. Sustained, predictive fire broke the rhythm of fighter attacks. Instead of controlling the engagement, the pilots found themselves reacting to an invisible barrier of bullets. The psychological impact was immediate. Even highly experienced aces rely on confidence and timing. Once those disappear, mistakes follow. Post-mission German reports began noting unexpected volume and coordination of defensive fire. Pilots complained that traditional escape paths were no longer safe. Some accused bomber gunners of firing recklessly. Others believed new weapons were being tested. None of them immediately understood the truth. The rules had changed. The Luftwaffe also faced a structural problem. Fighters attacked in waves, following similar patterns. This made coordination easier, but also made them predictable. The gunner's tactic exploited that predictability mercilessly. Each fighter that followed the same path increased the effectiveness of the trap. Most importantly, German pilots had underestimated desperation. Bomber crews knew they were flying into near-certain danger. Loss rates were horrific. Entire crews vanished without a trace. When survival drops low enough, caution stops mattering. What German doctrine failed to account for was the human factor, the moment when fear turns into resolve. By the time Luftwaffe commanders began discussing adjustments, the damage was already done. Word spread quickly among bomber crews. If one gunner could disrupt a fighter attack, others could too. The myth of bomber helplessness was dying, and once a myth dies in war, it rarely comes back. As the story of the engagement spread, one question immediately followed it. Did a single gunner truly destroy 12 Bf-109s in 4 minutes? The answer, like many wartime legends, sits somewhere between fact and interpretation. Air combat was chaotic, violent, and often impossible to document accurately. Pilots and gunners fired simultaneously, aircraft vanished into clouds, and confirmed wreckage was rare. Kill claims on both sides were frequently exaggerated, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes out of pure confusion. Historians today are cautious. While multiple German aircraft were certainly shot down or fatally damaged during that brief engagement, attributing every loss to one man would be misleading. Other gunners were firing. Structural damage and collisions played a role. Some fighters may have been written off later after barely reaching base. But focusing only on the number misses the point. What made this event extraordinary was not the score, it was the method. The gunners' sustained, predictive fire changed the behavior of an entire attacking force in minutes. Even if the true number was 6 or 8 or fewer, the tactical impact was undeniable. Allied after-action reports emphasized this shift. Crews described fighters breaking off early, attacking less aggressively, or avoiding certain approach angles altogether. That was unprecedented. Fighter pilots were supposed to dictate the battle. Now they were hesitating. The story also grew because it symbolized something bomber crews desperately needed: hope. For men sent daily into enemy territory with survival odds that felt like a gamble, the idea that intelligence and courage could tip the balance mattered more than statistics. Legends are born in such conditions. Military analysts understood this. They did not dismiss the story as exaggeration. Instead, they studied it. Gun camera footage, crew testimonies, and damage patterns were analyzed carefully. What they found confirmed the core truth. Sustained fire into predictable fighter corridors produced results. The gunner's identity was never clearly recorded. Some believe it was a waist gunner, others suggest a tail gunner. Records were lost, aircraft destroyed, crews killed on later missions. In war, anonymity is common. But anonymity does not erase influence. Whether 12 fighters fell or fewer, one thing was clear to everyone involved. The old way of fighting no longer guaranteed survival for either side. And that realization would soon reshape how bomber formations defended themselves across the skies of Europe.
After the mission, the bomber crews did what soldiers have always done after surviving the impossible. They talked. Word spread quickly through briefing rooms, mess halls, and crew quarters. Gunners compared notes. Pilots listened closely. What had once been dismissed as reckless behavior was now discussed in serious tones. Something important had happened in the sky, and it could not be ignored. Allied commanders took notice. Intelligence officers gathered after-action reports and noticed a pattern. Crews that reported sustained, coordinated defensive fire experienced fewer successful fighter attacks. Bombers that held tight formation and fired into anticipated approach and escape routes survived longer. The evidence was incomplete, but compelling. From this, a new concept emerged: airspace denial. Instead of treating defensive guns as tools to hit individual fighters, they could be used to make certain parts of the sky too dangerous to enter. Gunners were encouraged to think collectively, not individually. One gun did little. 10 guns firing in coordination could reshape the battlefield. Training manuals were quietly updated. Gunners were taught to study attack patterns and communicate quickly. Instead of tracking a single aircraft, they were trained to cover sectors. Continuous fire was still dangerous and carefully controlled, but it was no longer forbidden in desperate situations. This was a dramatic shift. Bomber formations themselves began to change. Aircraft flew tighter boxes to maximize overlapping fire. The formation was no longer just about navigation or bombing accuracy. It was a defensive weapon. Each bomber protected the others, creating layered fields of fire that punished predictable attacks. German pilots noticed immediately. Approaches that once felt routine became hazardous. Fighters were forced to attack from less optimal angles or at greater distances, reducing accuracy. The time spent lining up shots increased exposure. Losses climbed. The Luftwaffe adapted where it could. Some units switched to heavier cannons to fire from farther away. Others experimented with rockets to break formations before closing in. But every adaptation came with trade-offs: reduced maneuverability, slower climb rates, or limited ammunition. Meanwhile, Allied bomber survivability improved, not dramatically overnight, but enough to matter. Missions that once ended in disaster now returned with fewer empty seats. All of this traced back to a single realization born in 4 chaotic minutes. Bombers did not have to passively endure attack. They could shape it. And once that idea took root, there was no going back.
The shift in bomber defense did not go unnoticed by the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots began reporting higher losses and more dangerous attack conditions, even when intercepting formations that lacked fighter escort. What had once been a predictable hunt was turning into a calculated risk. For an air force already stretched thin, this was a serious problem. German commanders responded the only way they could, by changing tactics. One of the first adjustments was the increased use of head-on attacks. Instead of diving from behind or above, fighters charged directly toward incoming bombers. These attacks minimized exposure to multiple gun positions and reduced the time spent inside overlapping fire zones. But they were incredibly dangerous. Closing speeds exceeded 600 miles per hour, leaving pilots only seconds to aim, fire, and evade. A single mistake meant instant death. Another adaptation was heavier firepower. Some Bf-109s and Fw-190s were fitted with larger cannons designed to damage bombers from longer range. Others carried underwing rockets meant to break formations before fighters closed in. These weapons were powerful, but they also made aircraft heavier and less maneuverable. Pilots sacrificed speed and agility, two things that had once guaranteed survival. Despite these changes, the psychological damage remained. Fighter pilots no longer trusted the sky around bomber formations. Every approach felt uncertain. Every escape route was suspect. Even experienced aces found themselves hesitating, and hesitation was deadly. The Luftwaffe also faced a deeper problem: time. Training new pilots took months, sometimes years. Losses could not be replaced quickly. As bomber defenses improved, the cost of interception rose. Missions that once promised quick victories now carried unacceptable risk. Meanwhile, Allied bombers continued flying, day after day, deeper into enemy territory. The pressure mounted. Industrial targets were hit repeatedly. Fuel shortages worsened. Aircraft factories were damaged. The gunner's tactic did not win the air war alone, but it forced the Luftwaffe into a defensive spiral. Every new countermeasure created new weaknesses. Every loss reduced experience levels. By the time long-range Allied fighter escorts began appearing in force, German pilots were already fighting an uphill battle. The balance in the sky was shifting. And once momentum turns in war, stopping it becomes almost impossible.
For much of the war, Allied bombers had flown alone. Fighter escorts could protect them only part of the way, turning back when fuel ran low and leaving the bombers exposed deep over enemy territory. Those final miles were the most dangerous. German fighters waited there, confident that the bombers would arrive tired, damaged, and vulnerable. The new defensive tactics began to change that equation. As bomber formations grew tighter and gunners learned to deny key areas of the sky, the idea of bombers as isolated victims began to fade. They were still slow and vulnerable, but they were no longer defenseless. German pilots could no longer assume that repeated attacks would wear bombers down safely. Every pass now carried serious risk. This shift bought the Allies something invaluable: time. Time allowed engineers to refine long-range escort fighters. Aircraft like the P-51 Mustang, with its extended range and excellent high-altitude performance, were not simply technological breakthroughs, they were answers to a problem bomber crews had been suffering from for years. By the time these escorts began accompanying bombers all the way to their targets and back, the Luftwaffe was already under strain. The combination was devastating. Fighters now faced two threats at once: aggressive bomber defenses and enemy fighters that could match or exceed them in speed and altitude. Attacking bombers meant risking interception. Ignoring bombers meant watching factories burn. There was no safe choice. Bomber crews felt the difference immediately. While losses remained high, missions were no longer suicide runs. Crews began returning with damaged aircraft that would have been destroyed earlier in the war. Morale improved, not because the danger disappeared, but because survival felt possible. The idea that had begun with one gunner's desperate decision was now fully integrated into Allied air doctrine. Bombers were part of a system, not expendable tools. Every gunner, every fighter escort, every formation position mattered. Air combat had evolved. The sky was no longer a place where only speed and aggression ruled. Coordination, anticipation, and control of space now mattered just as much. And the Luftwaffe, once the undisputed hunter, was slowly becoming the hunted.
Even as the tactic spread, many bomber crews continued to call it suicidal, and for good reason. Sustained defensive fire came with severe risks that could kill a gunner just as surely as enemy fighters. The decision to hold the trigger down was not heroic bravado. It was a calculated gamble made under extreme pressure. Bomber guns were not designed for long, continuous firing. Prolonged use caused barrels to overheat rapidly, increasing the chance of jams or mechanical failure. A jammed gun in the middle of a fighter attack was a death sentence. Once a gun stopped firing, enemy pilots quickly noticed and focused their attacks on that blind spot. Ammunition was another problem. Gunners carried a limited number of rounds, and resupply in the air was slow and exhausting. Burning through ammunition in minutes meant that later in the mission, often during the most dangerous return flight, the bomber could be nearly defenseless. Commanders feared crews would survive one attack only to die hours later. There was also the physical toll. Gunners operated in extreme cold, sometimes below -40 degrees. Recoil from sustained fire shook the body violently. Oxygen deprivation caused dizziness and blurred vision. Fatigue set in quickly, making precise judgment harder with every second that passed. Perhaps the greatest danger, however, was exposure. Continuous fire revealed a gunner's position clearly. Tracer rounds acted like arrows pointing directly back to the turret. Enemy pilots could identify the source of the heaviest fire and concentrate their attacks there. A gunner who became the focal point of attention often did not survive. Despite all this, the tactic worked because it disrupted the enemy faster than it destroyed the gunner. The goal was not endurance, it was shock. If the fighters broke off quickly, the gunner could stop firing, cool the weapons, and conserve what remained. This explains why the tactic was never taught as a standard response. It was an emergency tool, to be used only when the alternative was almost certain destruction. It demanded discipline, timing, and a willingness to accept enormous personal risk. The gunner who first employed it understood this instinctively. He was not trying to win the battle, he was trying to survive the next few minutes. And sometimes in war, survival demands choices that look insane to anyone watching from the ground. As the war continued, the story of the gunner spread far beyond the crew that witnessed it. Like many combat tales, it grew with each retelling. Numbers became sharper, timelines became tighter. The phrase 12 fighters in 4 minutes began to sound less like a report and more like a legend. But legends in war often form around something real, something important enough to be remembered. Military historians today approach such stories carefully. They compare mission logs, loss records, and intelligence summaries from both sides. In this case, while no single document confirms every claimed kill, multiple sources confirm a sudden, concentrated loss of German fighters during a short engagement with a heavily defended bomber formation. That alone is significant. More importantly, doctrine changed. Armies do not rewrite training manuals because of rumors. They do so because evidence demands it. The sustained fire tactic was discussed, tested, and refined. It appeared in after-action analyses and influenced how bomber formations were flown for the rest of the war. That impact cannot be exaggerated away. The identity of the gunner remains unclear. Records were destroyed, aircraft lost, and many crews did not survive long enough to tell their stories. This anonymity is not unusual. Thousands of acts of bravery in World War II were never formally recorded. Medals often went to those who survived long enough to be noticed. In a way, anonymity strengthened the story. It was no longer about one man. It was about what any desperate, intelligent gunner could do when pushed beyond the limits of doctrine. The lesson was transferable, repeatable, and deadly. German pilots, for their part, did not care whether one man or several were responsible. What mattered was the outcome. Attacks that once felt routine now felt dangerous. Confidence was replaced by caution, and caution in aerial combat often leads to failure. The truth lies somewhere between myth and mathematics. Maybe it wasn't 12, maybe it wasn't exactly 4 minutes, but something decisive happened in that slice of sky, and it changed how both sides fought for the rest of the war.
By the final years of World War II, air combat no longer looked the way it had at the beginning. The idea that fighters alone controlled the sky had been permanently broken. Bomber formations were no longer passive targets drifting through enemy airspace. They had become active, thinking systems, capable of shaping the battle before the enemy even fired a shot. At the heart of this transformation was a simple but powerful principle: control space, not just targets. The gunner's tactic demonstrated that victory in the air did not always depend on superior speed or sharper turns. It depended on anticipation. By denying enemy fighters safe approach and escape routes, bomber crews forced attackers into bad choices. Every option carried risk. That concept would echo far beyond World War II. Modern air combat still follows the same logic. Missile engagement zones, radar coverage, and defensive countermeasures all exist to do the same thing that gunner did with his machine guns: make parts of the sky lethal before the enemy arrives. The tools changed, but the thinking did not. During the war, this realization influenced everything from formation spacing to crew coordination. Gunners trained to communicate faster. Pilots learned to hold formations under pressure. Escorts synchronized their presence with bomber defenses instead of treating them as separate elements. The Luftwaffe never fully recovered from this shift. As Allied air power grew, German fighters found themselves increasingly trapped between defensive fire and escorting fighters. Losses mounted, experience drained away. By 1945, the once feared Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. All of this traced back to moments where survival forced innovation. No committee planned it, no general ordered it. A man under fire made a decision, and others learned from it. That is how warfare evolves. Not always through grand strategy, but through small, desperate acts that reveal a deeper truth. The sky would never again belong to the fastest hunter alone.
When the war ended, no monument was raised for the gunner who helped change the nature of air combat. There was no famous photograph, no clear name etched into history books. Like countless others who fought in World War II, his story survived only in fragments, mission reports, crew memories, and the quiet lessons passed from one airman to another. But his impact did not disappear. Every bomber that flew in tight formation afterward carried the echo of his decision. Every gunner trained to anticipate an attack instead of waiting for it unknowingly followed the same logic. The sky itself had become a weapon, shaped by human understanding rather than brute force alone. What makes this story powerful is not the number of aircraft destroyed, it is the moment of clarity under fire. Faced with almost certain death, the gunner did not panic. He observed, calculated, and acted. In doing so, he exposed a weakness in one of the most feared fighter forces of the war. The Luftwaffe had believed that control of speed and altitude guaranteed dominance. That belief collapsed when bomber crews learned to deny safe space. Once that happened, the balance of power began to shift irreversibly. War often celebrates aces, pilots with dozens or hundreds of victories. Their stories are dramatic, personal, and easy to tell. But wars are rarely decided by individuals alone. They are decided by ideas that spread, adapt, and multiply. This was one of those ideas. A single suicidal tactic became a defensive principle. A desperate act became doctrine, and a gunner, whose name may never be known, helped ensure that thousands of others lived to see the war's end. History remembers battles and generals, but sometimes history is changed by a man trapped in a glass turret at 25,000 feet, staring death in the face and choosing to fight the sky itself.